Parashat Miketz. This parsha always coincides with Hanukkah. In most years, it's the Shabbos of Hanukkah. If there are two Shabbosim, if the first day of Hanukkah is Shabbos, so we read Vayeshev the first day and Miketz the last day. And occasionally, Miketz can be read a little bit after Hanukkah, but it's always connected to Hanukkah. One of the great sages of the 16th century, known as the Shalah, Rabbi Shaya Halevi Hurvitz, who was a rabbi in Poland and later on in Israel. He wrote a major work which combines Jewish law with Jewish philosophy, with Kabbalah, and he makes a point that the Rebbe would always refer to, that whenever a Torah reading coincides with a holiday, even though the Torah reading is not about the holiday, you'll always find a connection between the holiday and the Torah portion. So with that introduction, we're going to look for a few hints in this week's parsha that relate to Chanukah. Let's start off with the beginning of the parsha. It starts off with Joseph. Last week we ended with Joseph being thrown into prison, and he asked the butler, whose dream he interpreted successfully, to remember him and mention his name to Pharaoh, but he forgot. So the whole idea of forgetfulness is highlighted over here. But we'll get back to that a little bit later about forgetfulness. But the parsha begins with the words, Vayihi miketz shnasayim yamim, and it came to pass at the end of 2 years, Pharaoh had a dream. And in fact, he had two dreams. What was the first dream? The first dream, he sees from the Nile, there were 7 nice-looking, well-built cows coming up, and they pastured in the marshland. Then, look, 7 other ugly-looking, thin cows were coming up after them from the Nile, and they stood besides the cows on the bank of the Nile. Then, the ugly-looking, thin cows devoured the 7 nice-looking, well-built cows, and Pharaoh woke up. So in this first dream, the lean cows, the ugly, lean cows, swallowed up and devoured the 7 good-looking ones, and they didn't look any bigger than they were before. Then he fell asleep and dreamed again. And look, 7 healthy and good ears of grain were growing on one stalk. And look, 7 thin ears of grain, parched by the east wind, were growing up after them. Then the thin ears of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy and full ears of grain. These were the 2 dreams, very similar dreams, that the weaker, the leaner, the inferior quality swallowed up the larger, more robust quality cow and stalks of grain. Here there's a direct connection to Chanukah. We know that on Chanukah, the ideal way of lighting the menorah, which the Talmud refers to as mahadrin min ha-mahadrin, those who are want to beautify the mitzvah within beautifying it. A super beautification of the mitzvah is not to light 1 candle every night or 1 candle for every member of the family, but to keep on adding on every night. That's the school of Hillel. The school of Shammai says, no, we go in decreasing order. We start off with 8 and we go down to 1. Now, what is the rationale for the school of Shammai? The Talmud gives 2 explanations. We'll just focus on one. That we find that in the holiday of Sukkot, in the temple, they would bring 70 oxen throughout the festival as sacrifices, corresponding to the 70 nations of the world. And how were they offered? It wasn't divided evenly into 70. The first day was 13, the second day was 12, then 11, then 10, then 9, then 8, then 7, total of 70, but in decreasing order. And therefore, the school of Shammai says, we also light the Chanukah menorah in decreasing order, in descending order. We start off with 8, we go down to 1. What's the rationale behind this example from the cows or the oxen of the holiday of Sukkot? They correspond to the 70 nations that are described in the Midrash as the 70 wolves that surround and try to devour the one lamb. And what happens in the holiday of Sukkot is that these 70 nations, the ones that threaten us, are eliminated, are diminished, step by step. So the whole idea of the menorah is likewise to bring down the evil in this world, to diminish the darkness and the evil in this world by first starting off with 8, and then we get rid of the evil, we go down to 7, we get rid of more evil, we go down to 6, and so on and so forth until we reach 1. So what is the theme over here? The theme over here is that there's a diminution, a decrease of the power of the nations, of the power of the darkness of the world. And that's the idea over here in Pharaoh's dream. He's seeing a decrease, a diminution. Here you start off with vibrant, robust, healthy cows and healthy ears of grain, and they're swallowed up, just like the darkness is swallowed up in the holiday of Chanukah. That's the school of Shammai. So you'll ask, well, why is only the school of Shammai hinted in this parsha and not the school of Hillel? So I'll give you 2 answers. One answer is, and this just came to mind, that the dreams of Pharaoh are mentioned right after Miketz, after the word Miketz, which happens to be the name of the parsha. What does the word Miketz mean? The end. And the Rebbe once pointed out that whenever we come to the word Miketz, it's immediately a hint to the end of days, to the Messianic age, which is the end of days. So when we're talking about the end of days, the school of Shammai's position will prevail. The Arizal, the great Kabbalist, says that now we follow the school of Hillel, and we light the menorah in ascending order, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But when Mashiach will come, we will be following the school of Shammai, and we'll be doing it in decreasing order. Why is that? So one explanation given is that when Mashiach comes, we will have the power to illuminate all the negative forces in the world, all the negative, harmful nations of the world that are threatening the Jewish people. They will be eliminated, and therefore we will follow the school of Shammai, who follows the pattern of elimination of the evil. Hillel says we're living in a time of a lot of darkness, so we have to focus on bringing light. And the light will dispel the darkness, but to take on darkness itself, take on evil itself, that's the school of Shammai that we will have the ability to follow in the days of Mashiach. So when the Torah says, Vayihi Miketz, and Miketz is an allusion to the end of days, in the end of days, it's going to be the school of Shammai that will prevail, that the cows will swallow up the lean cows will swallow up the fat cows. The fat representing the powerful evil will be swallowed up and diminished. But then there's a second way of answering the question. What about the school of Hillel? Where is that hinted in this parsha? And the answer is, it's hinted in the name Yosef, Joseph. Joseph is the protagonist of this entire parsha, in last week's parsha. Joseph is the viceroy of Egypt. He's controlling everything. But what does the word Yosef mean? The word Yosef means to increase. When the Talmud refers to the school of Hillel's position, it uses the term Mosef v'holech. We keep on increasing. We keep on Josephing, if you want to put it in English. We're constantly adding on more and more holiness. And you see that in Joseph's whole life. Joseph's whole life is a life of growth. When you look at Joseph in the beginning of last week's parsha, it sounds like he was immature, even if we interpret it on a higher level, but still, compared to the way he developed later, you see how Joseph is constantly striving to increase, to go higher and higher, holier and holier. Moreover, the name Joseph itself, Yosef, why was he so named? So when his mother named him, she said, Yosef Hashem li ben Acher, may God add for me another son. That as soon as she sees Joseph, she already sees it's not going to just be Joseph, there's going to be another son coming. It's going to increase. And it goes even more than that. The Tzemach Tzedek, the third Chabad Rebbe, once explained and translated the verse in a very ingenious way. Yosef Hashem li ben Acher, may God increase for me that the acher, the other one, the outsider, the outcast, will become my son. That Joseph had the power to transform the outsider, the enemy, the negative, to turn that into a child, a son, and make that positive. That's the power of Joseph's ability to increase, to not just add more, but to even take that which is negative and transform it. That's the power of Joseph, and that's what is hinted here that connects to Chanukah, which the whole idea of Chanukah, according to the school of Hillel, is to keep on increasing to the point where the light transforms the darkness into light. We don't have to fight the darkness. When Mashiach comes, we'll have the power to take on darkness directly and get rid of whatever trace of darkness may still be left. I mentioned before the idea that the parsha begins with the story that happens right after it tells you that the butler of the king, Pharaoh's butler, did not remember Joseph. He forgot Joseph. And that's the note that that's the transition from the last week's parsha to this week. It's on the theme of forgetfulness. And then finally he remembers. We also find forgetfulness again in the parsha. Joseph has a son. His first son he named Menashe. Why Menashe? Because the word Menashe comes from the word to forget. Because God allowed me to forget all my travail, all my pain and suffering. So again, we see the theme of forgetfulness. So how does that connect to Chanukah? So the answer is the word for forgetfulness, the name Menashe, if you rearrange the letters, it reads Hashemen, the oil. So that means that the antidote to forgetfulness is oil. Where do we get that from? The Talmud says this, that if you eat olive oil, that is good for your memory. The olives, without the olive oil, causes you to forget. You dip it in oil, you put oil on it, that helps you to remember. So we take the word Menashe, which means to forget, and we turn that into Hashemen, the oil. Another thing about Chanukah is not mentioned in the Mishnah. Why isn't it mentioned in the Mishnah? So one explanation that one could give, even though all of the other holidays are discussed in the Mishnah, Chanukah is mentioned in a few places incidentally. It's not really, doesn't go into the laws of Chanukah itself, because the whole idea of the Mishnah being put into writing was in order to prevent forgetfulness, because once the Roman Empire was taking over and sending the Jews all over the world, Jews would no longer be connected to the central academies, to the teachers of Torah, and if you didn't put the oral Torah into writing, it would be forgotten. So the whole idea of the oral Torah, of the Mishnah, is to prevent forgetfulness. But Chanukah transcends forgetfulness, because Chanukah is all about Hashem and the oil, the symbol of remembrance. If we take Chanukah to its logical conclusion, it takes away the need for the oral Torah to be put into writing, because Chanukah is the holiday of remembrance. What did the Greeks want? We say this in our prayer, Al Hanisim, L'hashkicham Torasecha, to make the Jews forget their Torah, to forget your Torah. To forget what? Not just to forget the Torah, but to forget that it's your Torah, you, God. You're the source of the Torah. That's what the Greeks wanted. So the whole thread of Chanukah was a thread of forgetfulness, the forgetfulness of the butler of Pharaoh. The butler of Pharaoh was the source of forgetfulness, you could say, that led later on to the attempt of the Greeks to make us forget. Chanukah is the antidote to that. Chanukah takes away from this forgetfulness. And by the way, it's customary when a person loses a relative that they study Mishnah in their memory. And the reason given is because the word Mishnah, if you rearrange the letters of Mishnah, it reads Neshama. So if you want to connect to a neshama, you do it through Mishnah. But there's another way of looking at it, that it says in the Talmud that when you take leave of your fellow, when you're traveling away from someone, you shouldn't separate from your friend unless it's through words of Torah. And that will help you remember your friend through the words of Torah. So in other words, when there's a separation, you need Torah to make sure that the separation does not degenerate into forgetfulness. So Torah, and especially Dvar Halacha, words of Jewish law, which is what the mission is all about, is what prevents the forgetfulness. So again, we have the idea that when you want to remember a person who's no longer physically here, you do it through Torah, specifically through Mishnah, because Mishnah, again, has the letters that means forgetfulness, and it also has the word Hashem, and the oil that prevents forgetfulness, and that's what keeps us connected. So what does the Torah tell us about the dreams of Pharaoh? He woke up in the morning and he was troubled by the fact that he didn't know what these dreams meant. And he knew that if he, as the king of Egypt, which was the superpower of that time, that his dream had significance. The Talmud says that generally dreams don't have meaning. But if you dream early in the morning and you didn't think about the subject during the day, that dream usually has prophetic elements to it. So Pharaoh has this powerful dream, two dreams, very powerful, and he knows that there's a message there, and none of his ministers, none of his sorcerers, none of his dream interpreters could give him satisfying interpretations. For example, what interpretations did they give him? One interpretation was, you're going to have 7 daughters, and you're going to bury 7 daughters. Another interpretation, you're going to conquer 7 lands, 7 countries, and you will lose the control over 7. And he didn't like those interpretations. He didn't like them. And the butler then realizes this is an opportunity he can use to promote himself. So he tells Pharaoh, I knew a Jew boy, that's how he refers to Joseph, in prison, and he successfully interpreted my dream. And the dream of the baker as well. So they take Joseph out of his dungeon and they bring him to Pharaoh, and Pharaoh tells him the dream, and Joseph says the dream is about 7 years of plenty that will be swallowed up by 7 years of famine, and that Pharaoh should appoint someone to gather grain in the 7 years of plenty, so that they will be used to support and feed the people in the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh goes bonkers for this. He's so excited about Joseph's interpretation that he gives Joseph the position of viceroy. He's second to the king. And in fact, he was even more powerful than the king. The king was only a figurehead. He occupies the throne. Joseph was really running the country. So the question is asked by all these different commentators. Number one, what's so brilliant about Joseph's interpretation? I can think of many average people who would tell you if you have a dream about cows and about wheat, it's about food. And if it's fat cows and robust stalks of grain swallowed up by meager cows and grain, it's a symbol that the fat will be swallowed up. Very simple interpretation. Why didn't Pharaoh's wise men give that interpretation? That's the question that commentators ask. And another question they ask, Pharaoh should have been upset at Joseph. Pharaoh asked Joseph to interpret the dream. He didn't ask him to give him advice. He didn't say, Joseph, tell me what should I do? Joseph should have just interpreted the dream and wait for Pharaoh to ask him, what do you think I should do? Maybe Pharaoh would come up with the idea himself. And Joseph, brazenly it seems, just tells Pharaoh, this is the meaning of the dream, and therefore you should do this and this and this, as if he's giving all the orders. So the Rebbe explains that the reason why they couldn't interpret the dreams adequately is because, and why they did give the interpretation they gave about 7 daughters you'll bury, and you'll have 7 daughters, you'll bury 7 daughters, you'll have 7 kingdoms, you'll lose 7 kingdoms, is because there's one thing about the dream that was difficult for them to interpret, the way Joseph interpreted. What was it about the dream that was unusual is that in his dream, the 7 fat cows and the 7 lean cows coexisted. They were both standing on the Nile before they were swallowed up. So if the fat cows represent years of plenty and the lean cows represent years of famine, how could they coexist? How could you interpret the dream that there's going to be plenty and famine at the same time in the same place? So therefore they said that couldn't be the interpretation about grain, fat years versus lean years. It must be something else that you could have at the same time. Yes, you could have, a person could have 7 daughters that he loses, that he bears, and then he can have other 7 daughters that die at the same time, where you can conquer 7 countries at one time that you lose in other 7 countries. Those 2 things could be there contemporaneously. But to have famine and plenty at the same time is an oxymoron. Like you can say, that's impossible. So what did Joseph do? But Joseph saw through it, and he said, you know what? God is not just telling you what is going to happen, he's telling you how to prepare for it. That you're going to prepare for it in a way that the plenty and the famine will coexist. How so? If you store all the grain from the years of plenty, and it will nourish the people in the years of famine, that means in the years of plenty you're already thinking, and your mindset is years of famine, and in the years of famine you're being fed by the years of plenty, so they coexist. And that's why Pharaoh was so impressed with him. He wasn't, and that's why Joseph gave this advice. He wasn't giving advice. He was interpreting the dream. That's part of the dream interpretation. And that's why Pharaoh was so overwhelmed with his brilliance. He says, wow, this is brilliant, that the dream is not just telling me the future, it's telling me how to deal with the future. The whole idea of having years of plenty and years of famine at the same time, 2 opposites coexist. The Rebbe says that's one of the hallmarks of Golus, of exile. When the Jews came back from Babylonian exile, they described it kecholmim, hayinu kecholmim. We were like in a dream. Why is exile referred to as a dream? Because exile is a time when there are opposites functioning at the same time, where you could be in one place and be in a totally different place simultaneously, where you could be in a spiritual mode, and at the same time you could be very materialistic. People in exile, they're not just far away from the center of Jewish life geographically, they're also far away from the center of Jewish spirit, spiritually speaking, and that you can have 2 opposites at the same time. But by the same token, that means that Golos has this very powerful dynamic. To have 2 opposites coexisting is something beyond the natural. It's something beyond the norm. So that means, as the Rebbe explains, that when we talk about the Geula, the redemption, it's not a negation of exile, because exile really has a very powerful spiritual dynamic that doesn't express itself in a positive way. It expresses itself in a negative way. Redemption means we're going to take the powerful dynamic of exile, the ability to combine opposites, and translate that into something very positive. So it's going to be revealing the hidden nature of exile. And that's why Rebbe would always point to the comment of the Alter Rebbe, whose Day of Liberation we celebrated this past week, that the Hebrew word for exile, Gola, and the Hebrew word for redemption, Geula, are identical, except that Geula has the word Gola with an aleph inserted in it, which means that Geula is not going to negate exile, it's going to reveal the aleph standing for the one God, the master of the world. It'll reveal the Aleph in exile. You'll see the Aleph, you'll see the holiness in exile. Another thing about the dream, there's a little bit of a discrepancy. The Midrash points out, when Pharaoh says he's standing in the dream, he's standing on the river, on the Nile. When he tells Joseph about it, he changes it. He talks about how he's standing on the bank of the Nile. What's the difference? Because in the very first verse, at the end of 2 years, it happened that Pharaoh was dreaming, and look, he was standing on the Nile. The translator puts it by the Nile, but that's not what it means. It means on the Nile. But when he describes it, when he describes the dream, he describes it that he's standing on the bank of the Nile. Why did he change? Because it was disrespectful for him to say that he was standing on his God. Because the Nile was the deity of Egypt, because everything in Egypt depended on the Nile. The whole economy and the lives of all the people depended on the Nile, which irrigated all the crops. So it would be disrespectful to tell people that he was standing on his God. But the truth is, that's what he saw in his dream. And that's why the Midrash tells us, Joseph, in the Psalm of the day of the Thursday, Joseph says, Svas lo yadaiti, I don't know about this thing about the river bank. Tell me the truth. Because Pharaoh altered that detail in the dream. But there's a deeper understanding of why Pharaoh dreamt that he stood on the Nile. It describes what is the difference between our belief in God and the belief of pagans, and the belief that the Greeks tried to impose on the Jewish people, the paganism of that period. The difference is that we believe that God created us in His image. God is the creator, and He endowed us with godly energy. And we have to emulate God. And we have to subordinate ourselves to God, because He is the one on top of us. And we are given some of His energy to be able to fulfill our purpose in this world. The pagans created God in their image. We are created in God's image, but they believe that gods are created in their image. Whatever vice they believed in, whatever vice they behaved by, they created a god to justify it. So the gods, and since people have many different leanings, one day you want to be this, one day you want to change to be something else, one day you engage in this vice, the next day you engage in a different vice. You have to have a god for every vice. So that's why Pharaoh is standing on his God. The God is there to serve him, rather than he was here to serve God. Okay, we'll go to the end of the parsha. The famine forced Jacob's children to travel to Egypt, because Jacob says he saw that there was some grain in Egypt. Now, the Hebrew word for grain that here is used is shever. So our sages tell us that the word shever, if you change the dot from the right to the left, it reads sever. The word sever means hope. That Jacob prophesied, not knowing that that was the prophecy, that there is hope in Egypt, that's how he'll get his son Joseph back. Jacob didn't know that, but he just knew that there's some hope in Egypt. What kind of hope was he looking for? If it wasn't Joseph, because he didn't believe that Joseph was alive, even when he was told initially, he didn't believe it. So that what other kind of hope would there be? So one of the Chassidic masters explains, why were the sons of Jacob reluctant to go to Egypt? There's a famine, there's no food. And the answer is they had food. Rashi even mentions that Jacob didn't feel comfortable that everyone is going to Egypt to buy food, and they were not in need of food. They would look like they're showing off. But the brothers didn't want to go. The sons of Jacob didn't want to go to Egypt. Why didn't they want to go? Because Egypt was a very despicable place, was a very degenerate place. Egypt was referred to as Ervas Haaretz, the shame of the earth. It was like the most degraded place on earth, the most immoral place on earth, and they didn't want to go there. The brothers were shepherds because they didn't want to be involved in urban life, because urban life is decadent. They wanted to be alone with nature, with God, and tending to their sheep. And here they're going to be going to Egypt, the very source of immorality and vice. So that's why Jacob tells them there's some hope, there's something positive, there's a mission that you can fulfill by going to Egypt. You can liberate some of the sparks of holiness there. You could do something that would eventually change Egypt's immorality to some extent. And that hope turned out to be Joseph in the end, because Joseph was the one who had the greatest influence and impact on Egypt. There's a story told in conjunction with the fact that last week we celebrated on the 19th of Kislev the Alter Rebbe's liberation from prison. The Alter Rebbe was the founder of the Chabad movement, the first Chabad Rebbe, and his enemies who were opposed to the Chassidic way of life informed to the Tsarist regime against him that he was a rebel, he was supporting the Ottoman Empire by sending money to Israel, and that he was trying to set himself up as a Tsar himself. And they made all sorts of false accusations, accusing him of treason, which was a capital crime. And he was interrogated, and at the end of 53 days, he was exonerated, and that became a major Hasidic holiday, Yud Tes Kislev. So before he was arrested, knowing that he's going to be taken away, he sent a messenger to his colleague, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, to ask him to pray for him. So when the messenger came to Rabbi Levi Yitzchak said, "What's his name? What's his mother's name?" His name he knew, Schneier Zalman, but what's his mother's name? And the messenger didn't know. Either he forgot it or he never knew it. So, because when you call someone up to the Torah, you use the father's name, unless the person is sick and you make a mishaberach, you don't usually use the mother's name. So it's possible that he didn't know the Alter Rebbe's mother's name. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak opened up the Chumash to this week's parsha, and he read the verse that says, "And Jacob saw there was yesh shever, there's hope or grain and hope in Egypt." And the word shever, he said, is an acronym: Schneier ben Rivka. Now, the Reish could have been it could be another name, Rachel. It could have been other names that begin with a Reish. But Rabbi Levi Yitzchak obviously had divine inspiration, and he could have known it without even looking in the Chumash. So why did he look in the Chumash? So I have two explanations for that, possible explanations. One explanation is that how does someone of that caliber, of the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, the Rebbe, how do they know things that are not known to people? How would they know someone's name if that person never told them what their name was? How did we have stories of tzaddikim were able to tell people where their missing relatives were? There's a famous story of the Baal Shem Tov where a certain non-Jewish squire, he didn't know how his wife was doing, and he came to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov opened up a Zohar and looked in it and told him where his wife was. So why did he have to open the Zohar? Because the way these tzaddikim see things is they have access to the light of the first day of creation. The light of the first day of creation was not sunlight, it was light that you could see from one end of the world to the other. And certain tzaddikim have access to that light. But where is that light? Where can you find it? So our sages tell us God hid it, but it was put in the Torah. So if you read the Torah and you have a certain insight of the Baal Shem Tov or of Levi Yitzchak and others, you can see things that others cannot see. So when he looked in the Chumash, that's how he saw the name of Rabbi Schneur Zalman's mother. That's one possible explanation. Another explanation is that when Rabbi Levi Yitzchak saw the words Yesh Shever, he read it as a reference to the hope that existed in Egypt, in Golus, and that something positive will come out of that. And for some reason he felt that that is connected to the name of Rivka, because Rivka was the one who bore Yaakov and Esav, and Rivka was the one who was able to eventually bring the two together to refine even Esav. When the Torah talks about Rivka in one place, it says she's the mother of Yaakov and Esav, and Rashi says, I don't know what's the point in telling us that. We already know that. But the deeper meaning of that is that Rivka is the mother. Even though she favored Yaakov, she was ultimately the one who also wanted that Yaakov should influence and transform Esav and refine the sparks that are present in Esav. And that's what the Levi Yitzchak Berditchev saw when he saw these words, Yesh Shever, there's hope in Egypt. There's grain, and grain is another way of saying there's a possibility of liberating the sparks of holiness that are embedded in the grain of Egypt, the food of Egypt. He knew it was connected to the name of Rivka. Whatever the explanation is, he was right. Reb Schneur Zalman's mother's name was Rivka. One final thing. Joseph is acting very tough with his brothers. He was testing them to see how strong their desire was for Joseph to come back, to find him. They thought maybe he was in Egypt, and they were going to look for him and find him. He wanted to see how they get along with their brother Benjamin. And when he says to them, if you don't bring Benjamin to see me, then I will not let. He arrested Shimon. He put him in prison. He says he will not be released. You have to bring, and don't see my face again. You can't come here from food unless you bring Benjamin. And when they tell Jacob that, Jacob was distraught, and he says, I can't let Benjamin go. I lost one son from Rachel's son, Joseph. I don't want to lose the other one. And then Reuven tries to persuade him. He says, look, if I don't bring him back, you can kill two of my sons. And Jacob rejects that. And Rashi says, that's foolish. I mean, your sons are my children as well. Why would I want to kill your children? He didn't accept that promise. And then later on, Yehuda comes and he says, I will bring him back. I guarantee it. And he doesn't offer his children. He doesn't make such a grandiose offer, and yet he accepted Yehuda. Yehuda said that I forfeit everything in this world and the next world. I'm giving up everything if I don't succeed. So why did he accept Yehuda's promise to bring him back, to bring Benjamin back, and not Reuven? So one explanation given is that Reuven had 4 sons. By offering 2 of his sons, whether he meant that literally or he was saying, just as I will never allow my 2 sons to perish, that's how I will never allow Benjamin to not be brought back. But why did he only pick on 2? Why not all 4? The answer is he had an insurance policy that he'd be left with 2 sons. That means he wasn't prepared to give everything for this promise to bring Benjamin back. Yehuda says, I give everything away. I guarantee it. There's not a possibility that I will fail. Reuven had an insurance policy. Just in case he fails, he'll still have 2 sons left. If you enter into a venture to do something to save another Jew, and by extension to save Judaism, and you say, I will do it, I'll try hard, I think I'll be successful, but I'm not sure. I'm leaving a possibility open that I will be a failure. That's not the person you want to trust, and that's not the person who will bring salvation. Yehuda will bring salvation. Why? Because he says, I'm not allowing any room for failure. it will happen. I will bring him back. And that's why Yehuda merited that he would be the ancestor of Mashiach, the one who will ultimately bring the redemption, because Mashiach will not allow any possibility of failure. Mashiach is only capable of being Mashiach if he is prepared to give everything, guaranteeing total success. And that's one of the things that we're missing in Chanukah. Chanukah, the miracle was a tremendous miracle. We restored the Beis Hamikdash to its position of holiness. We got rid of all the impurity there. We had independence, but we didn't have Mashiach. We didn't have someone who was willing to take it all the way. What happened later with the Hashmonaim, the Hasmoneans, that they began to take more and more power to themselves, till one of them declared himself to be the king, and then they made a pact with Rome, and then they had a civil war, and it degenerated to the point where Herod became the leader and killed all the Hasmoneans. There's none of them that survived. The heroes of Chanukah, now we should be talking about the holiness of the people. The original Maccabees were holy. They sacrificed everything, but later on it degenerated into a point where they were no longer intent on going all the way. And if you don't go all the way, which would have meant they would have appointed someone, a descendant of King David, and that would have been the Messianic age. They missed that opportunity, and that led eventually to the Romans taking over and the Roman exile that has lasted to this day. But there's no question that we are living on the cusp of the Messianic age, everything that's going on in the world. And this Chanukah, we pray and hope, will be the first Chanukah in the newly rebuilt Beis Hamikdash, the third Beis Hamikdash, when we will see the Kohen Gadol lighting the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash. We'll still be lighting Chanukah candles. It says in the Medrash that when Mashiach comes, Chanukah lights will still shine brightly. But at the same time, we will be able to see the menorah in the Beis Hamikdash as well.